There were two names that dominated every major charity event, corporate deal, and high-profile auction: Dorian Vance and Celeste Whitmore. Their rivalry was the stuff of legend, whispered about in boardrooms and splashed across headlines. Dorian, a self-made billionaire, had built his empire from the ground up, transforming abandoned properties into architectural marvels that redefined city skylines. Celeste, the heiress to a vast old money fortune, had expanded her wealth through strategic investments, proving herself as a formidable businesswoman rather than just another socialite with deep pockets. They were both powerful, they were both wealthy, and they were both utterly obsessed with outdoing each other. At every annual gala, their silent war played out for all to see. If Celeste announced a $50 million donation to fund cancer research, Dorian would pledge $60 million for medical advancements. If Dorian funded a groundbreaking scholarship program, Celeste would counter with an entire university department in her name. It wasn't just about money, it was about winning. Neither would ever admit that the other was an equal, and for years, their rivalry fueled an ongoing spectacle of one-upmanship. They weren't just competitors in charity. Their business interests often clashed as well. When Dorian sought to acquire a major tech company, Celeste outbid him at the last second, making the deal one of the most expensive buyouts in history. When Celeste attempted to launch a luxury hotel chain, Dorian opened a competing line, offering exclusive features designed to overshadow her efforts. Their feud was even personal at times. At social events, they would deliberately avoid one another, yet their presence in the same room always drew attention. The media had long speculated whether their animosity hid something deeper, perhaps admiration, perhaps something more complicated. But neither of them had time for introspection. To them, life was a battlefield, and they were determined never to lose ground. Everything changed at the annual Philanthropy Summit in Manhattan, an event that celebrated the most generous figures in business and society. As expected, the night turned into a subtle yet intense contest between Dorian and Celeste. Celeste had just announced a massive initiative to build affordable housing for families in need when Dorian stepped forward and unveiled a rival program, one that provided not only housing but also financial training and career mentorship. The audience was captivated. The reporters took notes. Another battle had been fought, and yet again, the victor was undecided. Then, without warning, the event's chairwoman took the stage and played a video that neither of them had anticipated. The footage showed an orphanage in Brooklyn, its roof leaking, its walls cracked, its resources stretched to the limit. The narrator explained that the orphanage, Horizon Haven, was on the verge of shutting down. Over 50 children, already abandoned by fate, were about to be displaced once again. The room grew silent as the heartbreaking images played across the screen. And then, the most shocking detail was revealed. Horizon Haven had ties to both Celeste's and Dorian's families. Dorian's mother, once a struggling social worker, had spent years volunteering at the orphanage, helping the children as much as she could despite her own hardships. Celeste's grandmother had once been the home's main benefactor, ensuring it thrived. Neither Celeste nor Dorian had paid attention to these connections before. Their wealth had distanced them from their own pasts. The chairwoman's final words struck deep. Grand gestures and public donations are easy. What these children need is something lasting, not temporary aid, not symbolic gifts. They need real change. The question is, who among you will truly step up? For the first time, neither Celeste nor Dorian reacted immediately. There was no swift counteroffer, no public display of wealth, just silence. That night, both of them left the event without their usual sense of triumph. Instead, they were consumed by thoughts of Horizon Haven and by something unfamiliar, something that had nothing to do with competition, guilt. Dorian found himself walking through the streets of Brooklyn, passing by the same neighborhoods where his family had once lived before his father lost everything in a failed business deal. He remembered the nights spent in uncertainty, the kindness of strangers who had helped them get through their darkest days. His mother had believed in giving back, even when they had nothing. And yet, here he was, sitting atop a billion-dollar empire, more concerned with defeating Celeste than making a true impact. Celeste, meanwhile, retreated to her late grandmother's study, sorting through old letters and records. She found documents detailing years of donations to Horizon Haven, handwritten notes expressing concern for the children who lived there. Her grandmother had once believed that true wealth meant protecting those who had no one else. Somewhere along the way, Celeste had lost sight of that. The next morning, an unexpected envelope arrived at both of their offices. It was a letter from the Horizon Haven Board of Trustees. "We do not need competing donations. We do not need publicity stunts. We need vision, leadership, and commitment. If either of you truly wishes to help, prove it. Not with money, but with action." It was a direct challenge, one that neither Celeste nor Dorian could ignore. But this wasn't a challenge they could face alone. For the first time in their lives, they would have to do the unthinkable. They would have to work together. The idea of collaboration was foreign to both Celeste Whitmore and Dorian Vance. Their entire careers had been defined by competition, by the thrill of outmaneuvering each other at every opportunity. And yet, the weight of the Horizon Haven challenge lingered in their minds far longer than they expected. Neither of them had made an immediate decision. Instead, they retreated into their own worlds, analyzing the situation like they would any other business venture. Celeste studied financial reports on the orphanage, noting its rapid decline over the past decade. Despite generous one-time donations from various philanthropists, none of the aid had been sustainable. The issue wasn't just funding. It was mismanagement, lack of structure, and a failure to adapt. Dorian, on the other hand, visited Horizon Haven in person. He had gone without notifying the press, without making an announcement. What he saw unsettled him more than any financial report ever could. The roof leaked in 3 different places, the playground was rusted, and the children's mattresses were worn thin. He saw a 6-year-old boy huddled in a corner, reading an old, tattered book under a dim light. A teenage girl tried to comfort 2 younger kids who were crying after learning they might be separated if the home closed. Dorian, a man known for his ruthless business acumen, felt something crack inside him. For all his success, all his wealth, what had he really done that mattered? That night, both Celeste and Dorian arrived at the same realization, though neither of them knew the other was thinking it. They couldn't fix this alone. Their usual approach, simply throwing money at a problem, wouldn't work here. 2 days later, Celeste received a message from Dorian's office. It was a formal request for a meeting, something that had never happened before. Celeste, stubborn and prideful as ever, almost declined out of reflex, but something in her hesitated. 3 hours later, she found herself sitting across from Dorian in the private lounge of an exclusive members-only club, their usual battlefield for negotiations. But this wasn't about business, at least not in the traditional sense. For the first time in years, they were forced to acknowledge that neither of them had the upper hand. Despite their differences, they agreed on one thing. Horizon Haven couldn't just be saved. It needed to be transformed. The first order of business was control. They both knew that giving money to the orphanage's current administration would be a disaster. The existing management was well-meaning but ineffective. They needed an entirely new operational structure, one that would guarantee long-term success, not temporary relief. Dorian used his business connections to leverage a deal with the state. He proposed that instead of donating, they would acquire Horizon Haven and operate it under a private nonprofit foundation, ensuring they had full control over its future. It was a risky move. Many would criticize them for taking over what was once a public institution, but control meant efficiency, and efficiency meant results. Celeste, in turn, recruited top-tier professionals to restructure the orphanage's internal operations. She brought in education experts, child psychologists, and financial strategists, forming a board that would create a self-sustaining model instead of one that relied on inconsistent donations. This wasn't charity, it was an investment. Their next step was perhaps the most controversial one yet. 3 weeks later, the press exploded with news that no one had expected. Celeste Whitmore and Dorian Vance were partnering to launch the Horizon Haven Foundation. The headlines were relentless. Bitter rivals now business partners? Philanthropy or power play? Vance and Whitmore, a strategic alliance or a media stunt? Reporters speculated endlessly about their motivations. Critics accused them of using the orphanage for publicity, while conspiracy theorists suggested they were plotting some long-term corporate scheme. After all, why would two people who had spent their lives trying to destroy each other suddenly unite for charity? But neither Celeste nor Dorian responded to the noise. They kept working. Their first major move was a complete renovation of the orphanage. Instead of merely patching up the existing building, they tore it down and built a state-of-the-art facility in its place. It was no longer just an orphanage. It was a haven for children, complete with modern dormitories, classrooms, recreational spaces, and a career development center. But as construction began, unexpected problems emerged. As with any major endeavor, not everyone wanted them to succeed. Strange delays started happening on site. Construction permits that had already been approved suddenly faced legal challenges. An anonymous complaint was filed against the Horizon Haven Foundation, accusing them of improper financial practices. Celeste and Dorian, both well-versed in corporate warfare, recognized this for what it was: deliberate sabotage. The most unsettling moment came when Celeste's legal team discovered something alarming. The orphanage's previous financial records had been doctored. Money had disappeared, donations had vanished into unknown accounts, and certain individuals had profited immensely from the institution's past struggles. Someone had been using Horizon Haven as a personal bank, and now that Celeste and Dorian were stepping in, they were a threat. Dorian was furious. He had anticipated bureaucratic challenges, but not corruption at this level. Celeste, ever the strategist, took a different approach. If someone was fighting this hard to stop them, it meant they were dangerously close to uncovering the truth. Who stood to lose if Horizon Haven was reformed? That question was the key. And for the first time in their lives, Celeste and Dorian weren't competing against each other. They were fighting against something far bigger. Neither of them was prepared for what they would uncover next. The launch of the Horizon Haven Foundation should have been the start of something remarkable. Instead, it became a breeding ground for conflict, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. Despite their decision to work together, Celeste Whitmore and Dorian Vance had not magically become allies overnight. They were still the same fiercely independent, iron-willed individuals they had always been. Only now, their battles played out behind closed doors. The Horizon Haven board had been carefully selected, with industry leaders, education experts, and legal advisors, yet it was Dorian and Celeste who clashed over every major decision. Their arguments weren't public, but insiders within the foundation began noticing a pattern. Dorian, ever the pragmatist, wanted efficiency above all else. He pushed for a fast-tracked adoption system, arguing that children needed permanent homes rather than prolonged stays in an institution. Celeste, however, saw the flaw in his logic. Rushed adoptions often led to instability. She insisted on a carefully structured support system, ensuring children were placed with the right families rather than the first available ones. Meanwhile, Celeste fought for an elite-level education program, envisioning partnerships with top-tier private schools and universities to give the orphans opportunities that rivaled those of the wealthiest families. Dorian, however, saw that as unrealistic and exclusionary. What good was an Ivy League connection if most of these kids were struggling with basic literacy and emotional trauma? The boardrooms of the Horizon Haven Foundation became war zones of conflicting ideologies. Neither of them would back down. One evening, after yet another tense meeting, both of them left the office without speaking to each other. Celeste retreated to her penthouse, pouring herself a glass of wine, staring at the city skyline. Dorian, restless and frustrated, drove aimlessly through Brooklyn until, almost without thinking, he found himself outside Horizon Haven. A single light flickered inside the orphanage's temporary housing. Against his better judgment, he stepped out of his car and approached the building. Inside, a group of children sat together, passing around a notebook. Curious, Dorian stood unnoticed in the doorway and watched as one of the older kids, a 15-year-old boy named Marcus, scribbled something on a page before passing it to the others. When Dorian stepped closer, the kids froze. They weren't used to seeing him here, at least not without an entourage. Slowly, Marcus turned the notebook toward him. Dorian stared at the page. It was a list. Daisy wants to be a doctor. Luis wants to be a chef. I want to be an architect. Marcus. Emma wants to be a dancer. We all want a chance. Something about that last sentence hit Dorian harder than he expected. Not money, not a new building, not even adoption, a chance. He left without saying a word. The next morning, Celeste received a call from Dorian. There was no pretense, no hostility in his voice. "We've been doing this all wrong," he told her. From that moment on, the entire philosophy of Horizon Haven changed. Instead of viewing the orphanage as a temporary shelter, they restructured it as an incubator for opportunity. Children wouldn't just be placed into homes. They would be trained, mentored, and guided into stable futures. It was no longer about beating the system. It was about creating a new one. Celeste and Dorian divided responsibilities in a way that finally played to both their strengths. Dorian used his connections in the business world to form internship programs with companies willing to mentor older children as they transitioned into adulthood. He secured housing agreements that would allow those who aged out of the system to live rent-free for 2 years while they got on their feet. Celeste, meanwhile, pushed through her education initiatives, ensuring that every child at Horizon Haven had access to tutoring, career counseling, and professional development. She created a scholarship fund so that money would never be an obstacle for any of them. This was no longer just a rescue mission. It was a revolution in the way orphan care was handled. As their plan unfolded, an unexpected problem emerged, one that neither Celeste nor Dorian had foreseen. Some of the longtime staff at Horizon Haven resented the changes. They saw the new leadership as too corporate, too aggressive, a disruption to the way things had always been done. Whispers of discontent spread through the ranks. Meetings were missed, reports went unfiled, and procedures were quietly ignored. One night, Dorian received a phone call from a whistleblower within the foundation. "You need to check the accounting records," the voice said. "Someone's been moving money in ways they shouldn't." The next morning, Celeste and Dorian uncovered a disturbing reality. Over $300,000 in discretionary funds had been redirected to private accounts linked to a handful of the orphanage's senior staff. They had assumed the sabotage and resistance came from outsiders who didn't want Horizon Haven to succeed. They were wrong. The real opposition was coming from inside the foundation itself. The realization struck them both at once. This wasn't just about fixing a broken orphanage. It was about rooting out the people who had let it break in the first place. And those people weren't going to go down without a fight. Celeste Whitmore and Dorian Vance had built their lives around competition. They had fought each other for years, always seeking the upper hand, always determined to win. But now, for the first time, they were united against a common enemy. Horizon Haven had been corrupted from the inside. The discovery of $300,000 in misallocated funds was just the beginning. As Celeste and Dorian dug deeper, they realized that the financial discrepancies stretched back over a decade. Money that had been earmarked for food, medical care, and education had been siphoned into private accounts. Grants had been inflated, invoices forged, and contracts manipulated. The orphanage had never been struggling because of a lack of donations. It had been bleeding from within. At the center of it all was Richard Boyle, the longtime director of Horizon Haven. For years, Boyle had presented himself as a devoted administrator, a man who had dedicated his life to helping children. He had built relationships with donors, secured sponsorships, and cultivated an image of tireless dedication. But in reality, he had been exploiting the very institution he was supposed to protect. Celeste, ever the strategist, had her lawyers quietly dig into Boyle's financial records. The results were damning: a hidden property in upstate New York, unaccounted for luxury expenses, and multiple private bank accounts. Dorian took a more direct approach. He confronted the staff who had worked under Boyle, pressuring them to reveal what they knew. Some denied everything. Others hesitated, afraid of the consequences. But one employee, a woman who had worked at Horizon Haven for years, finally cracked. She revealed what many had suspected but had been too afraid to say. Boyle had been running Horizon Haven like a personal business. He had skimmed funds, manipulated budgets, and threatened staff who questioned his decisions. And now, with Celeste and Dorian taking control, he saw them as a threat to everything he had built. When Celeste and Dorian confronted Boyle directly, he didn't deny it. Instead, he laughed. "You think you can come in here and change everything," he said. "You think people like you, people who throw money around, understand what it takes to run a place like this?" He was confident that they wouldn't take him down. Celeste and Dorian were wealthy outsiders, and Boyle had spent years building alliances with influential figures in the city's charity network. If they went after him, he would drag them through a legal war that could take years. "You want a scandal," he smirked. "Go ahead. But when this place closes because of you, the headlines won't be about me." For a moment, Celeste and Dorian stared at him, realizing the weight of what he was saying. Boyle had played the long game. He knew that if they went after him publicly, Horizon Haven itself would suffer. Dorian clenched his jaw. He had spent his life dealing with ruthless businessmen, but Boyle was something different. He wasn't just greedy, he was calculated. Celeste, however, had a different idea. Instead of fighting Boyle head-on, Celeste and Dorian turned his own tactics against him. While Boyle was busy defending himself against whispers of investigation, Celeste and Dorian were restructuring the foundation from within. They quietly removed his allies, replacing them with their own appointees. They froze questionable financial accounts, forcing Boyle to scramble for explanations. And then, they did something Boyle never expected. They took away his power without ever making a public move. 3 weeks later, Richard Boyle walked into his office and found that he no longer had one. The board had voted him out. The same people who had once feared him now stood behind Celeste and Dorian, recognizing that change was inevitable. Boyle tried to fight back, but without his network, he was powerless. The following week, the authorities launched a full-scale investigation into his financial dealings. Celeste and Dorian had made sure of it. Boyle was done, and Horizon Haven was finally free from corruption. With Boyle gone, Celeste and Dorian set their full vision into motion. They expanded Horizon Haven beyond a traditional orphanage. The new facility included career training centers, therapy programs, and mentorship opportunities that ensured every child had a path to independence. Dorian's business contacts provided internships and employment opportunities. Celeste's education initiatives ensured that no child left the program without a future. Within a year, the orphanage that had once been on the verge of collapse was thriving. The media, once skeptical of their partnership, now hailed them as visionaries. And yet, despite their success, Celeste and Dorian never publicly celebrated. They had won, not against each other, but against a system that had been broken for too long. One evening, as they stood outside the new Horizon Haven facility, watching the children play in the courtyard, Celeste turned to Dorian. There was no rivalry in her expression. For the first time, there was only understanding. They had spent years trying to outdo each other. Now, they had built something that would outlast them both.